We are starting chapter 7 today. This is referred to as the Bourbon Era in Mississippi. This is between the years of 1876 and the 1900s. So second to lives lost, economic disruption caused Mississippi to suffer after the Civil War. Mississippi's cotton fields, railroads, factories, livestock, bridges, and buildings were destroyed. Economic recovery was slowed because of the political and racial conflict, but the Bourbon Democrats worked to overcome those distractions. So after the Civil War, when slavery was banned, there was a shortage of labor, especially obviously a shortage of free labor. So the Bourbons set up a controversial cost-cutting scheme called the Convict Lease system. And what this system does is it basically arranged for prisoners to be leased as laborers to private businesses who were responsible for their upkeep. So this kind of helped both private business owners and the state, because if the state does not have to pay to house and feed prisoners, they're saving money, and they're also making money from the prisoners being leased out. And the private businesses are saving because they didn't necessarily have to pay the convicts, pay very much to lease out a convict. So both the state and the private businesses were benefiting from this practice. However, the convict lease system became a scandal because convicts were abused, overworked, underfed, poorly clothed, and poorly housed. So when they realized how much of a scandal the system was, it was outlawed in 1903. One of the most significant industrial developments in Mississippi after the Civil War was the growth of the railway system. An increase in timber production stimulated the railroad construction. Increased vegetable farming across the country, in addition to a decline in water transportation, also helped to stimulate railroad construction. The problems caused by railroad expansion occurred mostly because railroads were not regulated, so larger lines worked to put smaller lines out of business, and there were a couple of monopolies back then. Eventually, the Railroad Commission was established, though, so that railroads were regulated by the government and there could no longer be monopolies on railroad systems. In 1865, over 2/3 of the land and area was devoted to timber production. In the very first chapter of our notes, we talked about how timber is one of our leading natural resources in our state. So after the Civil War, the state's timber resources provided jobs and income to thousands of Mississippians because farms were destroyed and things, but there were still trees. And if you cut down trees, you have your timber. And timber production doubled from 1870 to 1890. Majority of the state's factories were destroyed during the war, when we barely had any to begin with. So industry recovery was slow and expensive. In 1882, to promote economic recovery and attract new industries to Mississippi, our state, Mississippi, gave new industries tax-free periods for up to 10 years. And most manufacturing establishments were focused on agriculture, but cotton did still thrive. So if you came to Mississippi to start your industry, you were not taxed for up to 10 years. So the emancipation of the state's slave population, in addition to a disruption of the state's banking system, meant that farming had to change in Mississippi. After their emancipation, many black men took their wives and children out of the workforce, which made a labor shortage. Banks were wary about loaning money to farmers because they were uncertain about their ability to find laborers, grow a successful crop, and repay the money. They weren't sure that loans would be repaid due to there was no guarantee that these farmers were going to be able to make money and pay their loans back. So if a planter wasn't able to get financial help from a banker, they would sometimes go to local shops for help. And at the end of a growing season, the farmer would pay back the local merchant in full. So some stores were funding farmers and not banks. The labor shortage in Mississippi worked in favor for free blacks, though, because their labor was still in great demand, and that gave them strength and power. A sharecropping system was created where men worked on a planter's land in exchange for furnishings and a promise to share in the land's bounty. The sharecropping system proved unsatisfactory for both parties, though. At first, it sounded right and that it would work because now that blacks were free, they didn't have anywhere necessarily to go, and they didn't have a job. So they figured if they just stayed on a piece of land and lived on that, they could get paid and get some of the harvests, but it didn't work out. Sharecroppers were required by a crop lien law to remain on the land they were put in charge of until all of their debts were paid off. And black and white farmers both suffered as a result of the agricultural depression of the 1800s. So sharecropping was not a permanent, perfect solution by any means. Black exodus. A few years after Reconstruction, blacks began to leave Mississippi in large numbers, and it became so big of a deal that it became known as Black Exodus. Most of those blacks who left the state moved to Kansas because Kansas was promising high-paying jobs to them. But those promises were exaggerated, and Mississippi blacks actually found lots of poverty and exploitation when they moved to Kansas, so many moved back. Due to the labor shortage and the fear of the black exodus taking even more workers, many white planters and political leaders tried to attract European and Chinese immigrants to Mississippi. And their attempt to promote European and Chinese immigration in Mississippi was not nearly as successful as they had hoped it to be. Chinese laborers came a little bit more than European ones, but blacks still continued to be the major supplier of labor. As far as education was concerned in post-war Mississippi, in the 1880s there was a surplus in the federal treasury, and some of those funds were intended to be given to the schools. The senator at the time was strongly in favor of the funds being used towards schools, and a bill that would have given the funds to schools was not passed. So schools were underfunded, but schools were still established. The continued opposition to the education of blacks hindered the public school system as well, as far as not only funding, but people saying that black people should not be educated was also a huge issue. During most of the Bourbon period, there was a declining enrollment in black schools. Teachers' salaries and expenditures for black and white schools alike also declined. So colleges and universities were better supported than elementary and secondary schools because of those reasons listed above. So Mississippi established the first agricultural and mechanical college for blacks and the first state college for women. And from the end of Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century, 4 state institutions and many private colleges were established in our state. One of them is Alcorn. 1871, Alcorn University was established. We also had the State Normal School. This was a co-educational college for blacks established in 1870 as a department at Shaw University in Holly Springs. This was a very popular school. It was a college for blacks. And some people tried to shut this college down, like Vardaman, but his attempt failed and the school stuck around. Then obviously we have Mississippi State University. This was built based off of the Morrill Land Grant Act in 1862. And Mississippi State College was actually supposed to, this land was supposed to go to Ole Miss, but it ended up going to the Mississippi Agricultural and Mechanical College, Mississippi A&M, and then that college became known as Mississippi State. We also have the Mississippi University for Women. A woman named Sally convinced the state to establish a college for women. And they pushed and pushed because they kept getting told no, there wasn't enough funds. But then in 1882, Ole Miss accepted women, and they were still like, no, we want our own college. So finally, in 1884, Mississippi University for Women was established, and male students started to be admitted into their college in 1982. Then there's Jackson State, 1877. And then there are private schools. So blacks were eager to get an education after the emancipation, and several black private colleges were established. Some private colleges established included the following. And several of the colleges established were supported by or affiliated with a religious domination. So, in 1896, the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation of public facilities did not violate the United States Constitution if the separate facilities were equal. So, you could still have all black schools and all white schools as long as they were both funded the same, had the same level of education, things like that. And Mississippi and other states took advantage of this ruling, and they passed laws which segregated public facilities, which those later became known as Jim Crow laws. And then the Brown v. Board of Education decision in Topeka, Kansas overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1954. So, this is post-war politics. The Democratic politicians who helped defeat the Republican Party in 1875 were often called redeemers. Redeemers hoped to maintain political power, and they did so in a number of ways. They created the one-party system in color line politics. And color line politics is a vocab word. That's just the exclusion of people from political affairs on the basis of their color. And the drafting of the Constitution of 1890 was intended to keep power in the hands of Bourbons, uplifting whites and crippling blacks. So Bourbon politicians talked poorly about Republican rule and accused Republican officials of a number of untrue things. Newspapers echoed these accusations and contributed to them as well. The accusations were meant to make people fearful of the Republican Party and dreadful of their return. Democratic officials warned the people that newly arising parties were like the Republican Party, and as a result, the state remained a one-party system for nearly a century. Everyone was Democratic. L.Q.C. Lamar, a United States Senator and Secretary of the Interior, was the chief supporter of color line politics. He was highly influential, and he significantly influenced political appointments. He kept blacks in control of the Mississippi Republican Party for several decades. Exclusive groups developed in Mississippi during the time of a one-party system with like-minded views. Charismatic politicians emerged in Mississippi. The politicians that arose were well equipped at speech making, and the most successful Mississippi politicians could cuss the Republicans out the loudest, and they could keep blacks in their place, quote unquote. White farmers accused the Bourbons of neglecting their interests because the conditions of agriculture were poor, and thousands of Mississippi farmers, because of this, joined the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance, what that did is it encouraged cooperative buying and selling among farmers, and it promoted voting and participation in political campaigns. They were supporting each other, just like how we said local merchants would give farmers loans. And the main spokesperson of the alliance was Frank Burkett. So, increased political unity among poor whites worried Bourbons, and they saw the need to draft a new constitution to keep control. The Mississippi Constitution of 1890 gave the Bourbons control of the state legislature, and it deprived both blacks and poor whites who were dissatisfied with Bourbons. The Constitution also included new voting requirements involving a literacy test, and it required a poll tax, which meant you had to pass a test saying you were educated enough to vote, and you had to pay in order to vote. These provisions were designed to make it difficult for blacks to vote and to eliminate blacks as a major force in state politics. The Democratic Party remained in control for another 12 years in Mississippi because of these laws that were put in place. Also, under the Constitution of 1890, a 4-month school term in public schools was continued. The compulsory school attendance was repealed. The 4-year term of the governor was continued. Several state officials were prohibited from serving 2 terms, and state judges were appointed by the governor. The 1890 Constitution was a disappointment to white farmers in Mississippi, but it achieved virtually none of their goals. Small farmers and day laborers in the piney woods and northeast hills formed a new political group known as the Rednecks. They said, forget these Bourbons, we are Rednecks. We want to make our own political party. And that's where we leave off with Chapter 7.